Hello, friends. Welcome to week 2 of class. This week, we are going to be talking about the Individuals with Disabilities Educational Act. So let me share my screen and we'll do just that. Here we are. Maybe. It's going to load. There we go. Sorry, the internet has been super slow today. All righty. So without further ado, real quick recap from Intro to Education. And if you did not have Intro to Education, do not fear. I'm going to give you a recap regardless. An IEP is an individualized educational plan. And those are basically given to students who have particular impairments that make it difficult to learn. It's one of those equity pieces, right? So for example, a student who might have a reading disability might have the ability to go down to a special education classroom and have a class or have a test read to them. Not every kid would get that opportunity because not every kid would need that opportunity. So that's that equity level of making sure that we are giving students what they need. A 504 is really for health impairments. So for example, I had a student who didn't have any learning disabilities of any variety. He was actually valedictorian of his class and a state champion for speech team, but he was blind, right? So he had a 504 plan that basically required me as his teacher to print out all of his assignments in Arial size 32 bold font because that was what was easiest for him to read, and then to provide audiobooks when available. Which we actually didn't have our textbook on an audiobook. So the audiobook was me reading the book to him, which I felt terrible for him for because oh, who wants to listen to me read? And those are really important because they're that equity piece again, right? Like, does every student that I have need something in Arial size 32 font? Of course not. Most kids can see better than I can. But for him, that was key to him getting the education that he needed in order to be successful, which again is why those are so important. What's interesting about that is prior to 1975, he would have just been out of luck, which is horrible, right? Like, the thought that we just didn't educate some people prior to 1975 is a wild concept, but unfortunately, it's very real. So prior to 1975, in this case for disabilities, we're looking specifically at intellectual disabilities and mental illnesses. Okay. So we're not looking at let's say a student's in a wheelchair. We've always been a little bit better about kind of providing for students with that level of impairment. But particularly with intellectual disabilities and mental illnesses, prior to 1975, there was no resource that said that we had to really provide them a good education. Okay. And what we talk about in this case is a restrictive setting. So schools didn't actually have to provide any education to these students. So a lot would go on to live in state institutions for people with disabilities, most of which only provided minimal food, clothing, and shelter and just focused on keeping people alive, not really educating them or giving them any sort of life worthy of actually having. And guys, that's 1975 was not that long ago. I know that probably for some of you youngins, that feels like a million years ago, but that's only 50 years ago last year. That's within people's lifetimes still. So even if a parent wanted a better opportunity for their children prior to 1975, no resources or structures available to help them. And if you're really interested in this, we only hit this for really one unit in this class, but I'm 90% certain this summer I'm going to be teaching a class called Education for the Exceptional Child, where we will really dive into this. This is kind of the brief overview just that we're talking about in terms of diversity. But there's a whole lot that we could talk about with special education here. So in 1975, we passed the EHA Act, which was the Education for All Handicapped Children Act, which, yes, is not terminology we would use nowadays, but at least it was a step in the right direction at the time. Before that, schools had the right to refuse services to students who had any sort of disability, just straight up refuse services. So for example, my little sister has, so she had epilepsy and she had a traumatic brain injury that was a result of that. And she's severely disabled as a result of that, right? Like, she will always live with my parents. She was part of our life skills classroom here at Vienna High School. Prior to 1975, my parents would have taken her to a school and the school would have been like, yeah, we ain't touching that. And that would have been acceptable, which is crazy to me. Before the EHA was passed, it's estimated that 1.8 million students were excluded from school. It's a whole lot of kids, guys. In 1990, we reauthorized the EHA and we rename it something a little bit better. It becomes IDEA, which is the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we expanded to provide better services to kids. Because even though the EHA required us to actually educate students who had disabilities, it didn't necessarily require us to educate them well. So 1990 is when we really kind of revitalized that. In 2004, we had the most recent reauthorization for IDEA, which was early intervention for students who might not have an IEP, higher standards for special education teachers, and greater accountability. That was in the same phase as that No Child Left Behind Act, where you actually, when we're looking at school testing standards and things like that, you would actually look at your IEP categories and make sure that you're educating those students as well. 2017 was the most recent IDEA update, which was in the court case of Andrew versus the Douglas County School District. And basically the idea was that even when considering a student's unique situations, IEPs have to be designed so that a student makes progress in some capacity. And what that means is basically it's going to look different for every student, right? So for my sister, when she first came home with her traumatic brain injury, she could not eat. We fed her through a feeding tube. We had this, like, the thing when you go to the dentist and it sucks the spit out of your mouth. Like we had one of those that we kept because she couldn't swallow her own spit. She wore diapers. She couldn't walk. The doctors told us that's basically the best we could ever hope for. Now she's in her late 20s, which is crazy to think about. She has a vocabulary of about 40 words. She isn't able to live on her own independently, but she, watches TikToks and kind of has the mentality of maybe like a 10-year-old, but living her best life nevertheless, right? So her IEP was never going to expect that she was going to be able to take, college dual prep English or whatever, right? She was never going to have to write an essay to graduate from high school, but her IEP was designed so that she could make progress. She learned how to sort silverware so that she could help with dishes. She learned how to make herself a sandwich. She learned how to get herself dressed. And while that would not be an adequate goal for a student who is much higher functioning, it was a goal for her to make progress. So it was appropriate for her. So that's kind of what the 2017 update was focused on, was making sure that everybody's were set to where they could make progress, and it's progress that at a level was appropriate for them. So a student who had a mild reading impairment would not have the same level of expectations that my sister would have had, because obviously they can accomplish way more than that. So it was just kind of more individualized stuff. Anyway, so kind of looking in a little bit more at IDEA and how this impacts the different age categories. You look kind of at birth to 2 years old. In 2005 to 2006, which would have been roughly around the time that some of you all would have been being born. Others not so much. We actually had 299,048 infants and toddlers with disabilities from birth through age 2 who were served under Part C of IDEA. By 2018 to 2019, the number of infants who were served were 409,315. And that's not because of some weird conspiracy that like infants were getting sicker. It's more because we were getting better at early identifying disabilities so that we could provide those early interventions. And early interventions can make all the difference. If you know that a student is or a child is struggling and you're able to get them the services they need, a lot of times they can overcome things that might have in the past been a permanent impairment for them. Looking at ages 3 through 21, which is kind of what your public school special education group serves. In 2018 to 2019, there were 7 million students and some change with disabilities that were served under Part B of IDEA. In 27 to 2018, 72.7% of students with disabilities exited high school with a regular high school diploma, and there was a 16% dropout rate, which isn't as good as we want it to be, but is certainly better than pre-1975 dates. And then in 2005 to 2006, there were 675,466 teachers and service personnel employed to serve students with special needs. By 2017-2018, that number had increased to 942,446. And honestly, we anticipate that number probably will continue increasing as we get better at recognizing students who have particular needs and how we can help them. Looking specifically in the state of Illinois, since that is where we are located, 1992, there was a court case called Corey H. versus the Chicago Board of Education. And it was 4 families of special education students in CPS, which is the Chicago Public School System, who alleged that CPS was basically not doing service to their special education students under IDEA with regards to what we call LRE, or least restrictive environment. And what that means is that students who have special education services are required to be in as many mainstream classes as they can. So for example, going back to my sister, obviously she could not take an English class where she could write an essay. She can barely write her name, but she did take an art class, right? Now, was the art she was producing the same level as other high school students? Of course not. But could she still paint and learn to enjoy art? Absolutely. She loves doing like I have like little watercolor things that I buy her every year that you just add water and like she loves doing art stuff, right? So the idea is that you should put your special education students in as many regular education classes as possible when it is beneficial for them. For example, like my sister couldn't take regular PE because she has a she had extreme scoliosis and had to have a metal rod installed in her back. So obviously, like regular PE would have been dangerous for her. But for most special education students, you don't need a special PE class, right? Not unless you have some sort of physical impairment. So you could be in a regular ed PE class. Plaintiffs argued in this case, this Corey versus Chicago Board of Education, the plaintiffs, of course, being the families of the special education students. They argued that mainstream teachers didn't get enough education to actually take care of special needs kids. Basically, what they were saying wasn't that CPS was discriminating against their kids because they were being hateful. They were discriminating because they didn't know better. ISB, which is the Illinois State Board of Education, got super offended that parents implied that the teacher training wasn't sufficient, and then they got involved in the process. And you've got to remember that in 1992 and prior to that, special education students were pretty exclusively confined to special education classrooms, and the idea of including them in regular classes was a bit radical at the time. Now it's perfectly normal, right? Like you would be totally shocked if you were like, what do you mean special education PE? That kid is perfectly capable of running. Prior to 1992, that wasn't the case, guys. So the plaintiffs argued that excluding them went against the entire idea of what IDEA was founded on, which it did. And the Illinois Supreme Court ruled in favor of the parents. Okay. Which is why we have this least restrictive environment nowadays. So the Illinois Supreme Court does end up agreeing with the plaintiffs that maybe teacher education is flawed and we don't have enough work preparing teachers to work with students with special needs kids. So now even teachers who are planning on like, so if you're planning on becoming a special ed teacher, you're going to have 6 majillion classes in special ed. Expected. But if you're going to be a regular education teacher, you're also going to be required to take a class called Education for the Exceptional Child, or whatever your university has it named, that requires you to learn how to best serve students with IEPs who might be in your mainstream classroom. And because ISB was involved in the lawsuit, it originally would have just applied to CPS, but since ISB got involved, it then trickled down and involved all teachers in Illinois, which is why you've ended up in a class on diversity, schools, and society learning about this, and why you will also have to take some sort of class about educating exceptional children by the time you're done with your degree. So it all comes full circle in the end. So IDEA was this super landmark case that changed everything for the disabled community, right? So you are going to, and like I said, I know you're probably thinking after watching, Teach Us All that this is a long video, but don't stress. I think it's 10.
Aileen.
Yes, it is 10 minutes and 59 seconds. I am not going to show it here because I don't trust that the internet is actually sufficient to load it and me at the same time. So you'll need to go in and watch this video. But it was basically on the 30-year anniversary of the ADA Act. And I want you to kind of look at it and you're going to reflect on it in your reflection notebook. So again, that is this bad boy right here. In theory, you have already answered these top 3 questions. If you haven't, go back and do it. That way you don't get behind. But we're on this question right here. So what sticks out to you from the video from you just watched? What are some lessons? Just tell me what you thought about the video in a paragraph. Heading back over here. So we talked a little bit about intro to education too. We talked about IEPs, in intro to education, but no worries if you didn't have that class. You're not behind. I'm still going to tell you everything you need to know. So IEPs stand for Individualized Education Programs, and they are a document that is designed specifically to look at what a kid needs to be successful and to be that equity piece for them to ensure that they're receiving what they need. So the purpose of an IEP is to set educational goals for the child and communicate what the district will do to support that child. If you work in elementary school, you won't see this element of them, but high school teachers, IEPs have something in them called a transition plan, which is transitioning them for adult living. Okay. The IEP team consists of key school staff. So that is a team that includes administrators, special education staff, regular education staff, parents and guardian, and everywhere possible, the child themselves. Children are encouraged to go to their own IEP meetings and have a say in that, which I personally love. Although, if that's not necessarily good for a child, they might not have to, but it is good if that is something they can participate in. If it's determined that a child has a disability that's covered by IDEA, an IEP meeting legally has to be held within 30 days to set up services. And yes, schools are required to test to make sure that you actually do need those services. If I would have to bring our school psychologist in here to tell you more about those tests, or I can tell you more about them when we learn about it this summer, but that would be a whole nother unit all on its own. But there's different tests that are basically administered to determine whether you have a particular disability or not. If it turns out that you do test into that, you qualify for IEP services. Again, students are allowed to be part of creating their own IEPs, which is pretty cool. IDEA does require that students be present at any meeting where those transition services are held, which again means that high school students do have to attend their IEP meetings because part of that is planning for their adult life, right? Whereas if you have a highly special needs child who's in kindergarten, it might be determined that it's more productive for the IEP meeting for the kid not to be there. But by the time they get high school, they have to be present. Per the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, all IEPs have to include the following things. Where are the child's current levels of academic achievement? What are the annual goals for the child? What do we want to accomplish in this school year? What services are the school providing? How much time do you spend in specialized education classes away from your non-disabled peers? And again, that should not be 100% of the time unless it is a very, very severe case, because we want that least restrictive environment. So can that kid take a regular art class? Can that kid take a regular PE class? Can they be in a regular homeroom, for example? What modifications to assessments will be made? So like, does the kid need the test read out loud to them? Like even though my blind kid was technically on a 504, he received special services where he had to have the SAT read to him because again, he couldn't see it. So when he took the it was the SAT that he took back then, because that was the time period he was in, I got to read that to him. Other things that are on IEPs include when services begin, how often they're provided, where they're provided, how long they last. So does a student receive 30 minutes of one-on-one math instruction each week or something like that? And then how school personnel will measure progress towards those goals. They can include more than that. That's the bare minimum of what they have to have. So when you're kind of looking at, again, your IEP team, it of course has the parents of the child. It has the special education teacher, a general education teacher, and then from here, as it kind of heads down, some of these roles might be duplicated, right? Someone to interpret the evaluation results. So if your school psychologist is the one administering the tests to determine whether they qualify for those special services or not, they would be present. There can be a representative of a public agency. That's more common in big cities than it really is around here. But, if there's extra resources, they can do that there. If it's a student who's an English language learner, a bilingual specialist can also be present. Same with translation services if the parents don't speak English. Positive behavior strategy specialist if that's needed. The child if it's appropriate, or if they're in high school discussing a transition plan. And then, of course, anyone the parents deem necessary for special expertise. So the parents do have a lot of rights in here. As far as eligibility for an IEP goes, IDEA has determined that these categories are the ones that count as eligible for an IEP, or for an IEP, sorry. Oh my gosh, as eligible as being counted as a disability. I'm so sorry that I can't talk sometimes. Autism, deaf blindness, that'd be if you're blind and deaf, deafness, a hearing impairment, mental retardation, and again, that being used as a technical term there. We do not use retard as a slur to make fun of children. If you do, I will find you and it will not be pretty. Multiple disabilities, because some students have more than one. Comorbidities make those present often. Other health impairments, we're going to go into what OHIs are over here. Specific learning disabilities, speech impairments, language impairments, traumatic brain injuries, visual impairments, including blindness, or serious emotional disturbances, which we're going to hit in the ED category over here. So whenever it said other health impairment, here's what these include. And these are often kind of presented as 504 plans instead. So these are just health impairments that can impair a child's alertness to their educational environment, but aren't necessarily ones that like a learning disability would directly impact your ability to learn, whereas another health impairment might just impact you in general. Like, for example, diabetes is on that list, right? Our kid who was ranked, I don't remember what he was ranked in our class. He was like one of the top kids in the class, brilliant math kid. He had type 1 diabetes and had it his entire life. That did not impact his ability to learn. That kid was brilliant. But it did impact the fact that we needed to make sure that as teachers, we had orange juice in our rooms at all time. Otherwise, if he went into a situation where he needed a sugar influx, we would have been screwed. So like, you can have these health impairments and require special services, but they might not impact your learning per se. Other things that are on that list are chronic and acute health problems, epilepsy, attention deficit disorder / attention deficit hyperactive disorder, diabetes, heart conditions, hemophilia, which is a bleeding condition, lead poisoning, leukemia, a type of cancer, nephritis, rheumatic fever, sickle cell anemia, or Tourette's. Emotional disturbances are also, they don't necessarily require a specific diagnosis in the same sense that an other health impairment would, but they have to demonstrate at least some of these prolonged characteristics that negatively impact education, such as an unexplained inability to learn that isn't caused by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, inability to build and maintain relationships, inappropriate behaviors and feelings under normal circumstances. Um, Technically, anxiety can fall under this, but that's probably the most common one that you see, or fears that manifest as physical symptoms that get related to school. You don't really see as much of the emotional disturbance ones as you do other health impairments. I would say that other health impairments are probably your most common ones, with the typical idea ones being the second most common ones that you would see. So the way the special education process works is that before a student is referred for special education services, they should be taking part in what's called an RTI program, or response to intervention. The idea is that most of your students should be in a school should be performing in this green area, where little basic fixes will make things better. So if a student is struggling, we offer them tutoring. Tutoring fixes it. The student is good. We move on with our life. Tier 2 is whenever they receive group services. So maybe I notice that I have a group of kids who are struggling. So like tier 1 would be like, I help you with your math homework. Tier 2 would be like, I put together a math group and you come in once a week and we do like extra math help. Tier 3 is individualized services, and that's kind of when you start hitting like perhaps you need an IEP. It also requires that schools determine what the cause of the learning struggle is and make sure that it's actually related to an idea category. So going back to those idea categories, you'll notice that, for example, not being proficient in the English language is not on this list because that's not a learning disability. Okay. So if you're not proficient in English, you do receive services for English learners, but you're not like given an IEP and special education for that. That's not what those are for. Those are two separate circles, which is also a recent development in things. So to kind of detail your IEP or your response intervention triangle, this is again telling you what this looks like here. So academic systems is kind of what we talked about on the last side. Behavioral systems would be like things you do for all students. So your tier 1 would be like, oh, we offer attendance awards for students with good attendance. Yay. Tier 2 would be like, oh, we have noticed that this particular group of students is expressing intense anxiety, so we're going to get them together for group counseling. Whereas tier 3 would be like, okay, you need particular help. We're going to have you do some one-on-ones with a counselor. Your IEPs are legally binding documents. So for those of you who are planning on actually being teachers, if you get a student who has an IEP, you are legally obligated to do all of the things that are on the IEP, whether you agree with it or not. Okay. That is that student's legal right. So even if you think, oh my gosh, this student doesn't need whatever intervention has been proposed there, that's not your call. Okay. You are legally obligated to follow that IEP. And in fact, students have some rights as well, as do their parents, including the right to participate in IEP meetings. You cannot have a secret IEP meeting and not tell the parents and student about it. That's not legal. They also have the right to request an IEP meeting at any time. So if they feel like they're not receiving services, they can call for an IEP meeting and the school's got to schedule it. That doesn't mean at any time like you have to have it like at midnight. It just means that if they want to have one through the school year, you've got to have one. They also have the right to have their child evaluated by non-school personnel. So if they feel that the school personnel is saying that their child doesn't qualify for this disability or particular service, and they feel like they should, they do have the ability to get them evaluated by a third party, but they do have to pay for that themselves. They also have the ability to give or deny consent for a student to be part of the special education program, which we're going to talk about in our reflection notebooks, because that's kind of interesting, right? Like a school can determine, oh yes, this student has this disability, and the parent does have a legal right to say, nah, I don't want services. The student has a legal right to say, no, I refuse my services. They have the right to ask for due process hearings if they disagree with the decision, and they do have the right for the school to pay for private education if the school can't provide what the child needs. So, for example, my little sister, going back to her, just because obviously I'm super familiar with her story, at the time, whenever she was in grade school, there was not a special needs classroom for students with her level of disability, right? They had special education services, but it was more just for kids with regular learning disabilities, not for kids with profound disabilities like she has. So she actually attended the Marion School for was it for the blind or for the deaf? It was a specialized school in Marion. It is shut down since then. It's not open anymore. But it was a very specialized school for just kids with very extreme special needs. And she qualified. Basically, the school paid for her tuition to go there. The school that she would have attended paid for her tuition to go there because they couldn't provide her the services they need or that she needed. By the time she got to high school, there was a high school life skills classroom, which if you ever want to see a life skills classroom in action, you need to request to come see Miss Hunsaker teach here at Vina High School. She is phenomenal and she is killing it in the life skills department. But she has a classroom that is for kids with those profound levels of disability, and they receive the services they need. My sister was a graduate of that classroom. And obviously Miss Hunsaker serves students beyond just that as well, but like that's kind of like her specialty area, if you will. So in your reflection notebook, you are going to reflect on this question. What are the pros and the cons of a parent being able to deny a school suggestion for IEPs and special education services? And I want you to consider both the pros and the cons, which is why I didn't go into a ton of detail on the last side, because I don't want to tell you what to think. I want you to think about it yourself. Okay. So for some common impairments, these are, of course, by no means every single impairment that you're ever going to run into in your life. These are just some common ones. So we're going to kind of briefly hit them. Physical impairments are things that particularly impact the physical body, right? Like cerebral palsy, spinal bifida involves your actual spine. A traumatic brain injury can be caused by a variety of things. Like, for example, my sister had a seizure that wouldn't stop, and I'm not entirely sure if the traumatic brain injury was caused by the medicine that they had to give her to stop it or by the fact that it wouldn't stop, but that was where hers come from. Other people have had traumatic brain injuries because they've been in car wrecks. Right. So it varies greatly. Wheelchair users, visual impairments, including blindness, hearing impairments, including deafness and Down syndrome. Your social emotional behavior ones are probably a little more common, I would say. At least I feel like I've run into more of them in my teaching career, at least. Autism spectrum disorder has become more prevalent over the years as we've expanded the spectrum to include what autism counts as. Like when I was a kid, the only people they diagnosed as autistic were like fully nonverbal children. Now we actually recognize that autism is a spectrum. And again, if you're really interested in this summer, Education for the Exceptional Child, we hit all of this in super detail. Oppositional defiant disorder is whenever a student has the inability to reconcile with authority figures. Attention deficit disorder is your inability to pay attention. ADHD, of course, is that with the hyperactive element. Conduct disorders are basically when children are unable to behave according to standards, if you will. Obsessive compulsive disorder. People like to joke about having this all the time, but it is a legitimate disorder. And it can manifest in multiple or both ways with intrusive thoughts that you really can't control, or a compulsive need to do something, even though you recognize it has no logic to it. Anxiety and depression. I think we're probably all familiar with that. And then bipolar disorder. Some common learning disabilities are dyslexia, which impacts the way that basically your brain perceives letters on pages. Dysgraphia, which is, oh my gosh, my brain just completely shut down. This is so embarrassing. Dyscalculia, I can tell you right now, is whenever you, I'm sorry, dysgraphia is your writing version of it. It's dyslexia, but it's not reading, it's writing. Sorry, my brain just like shut down for a second and straight panic. Dyslexia is your ability to read letters on page. Dysgraphia is your ability to transcribe letters on page. Good Lord. Dyscalculia is basically an issue with your brain and how it processes numbers. Nonverbal learning disabilities would be students who have ability communicating. Like perhaps they are not able to speak. Like, for example, my sister has a limited vocabulary of only like 40 words. Even though she can say some words, she's still considered nonverbal. Other students can't speak at all. Sorry. Dyspraxia, I skipped right over that one. That's your fine motor skills. So that impacts your ability to like kind of do like detailed dexterous work. And then intellectual disabilities kind of vary based on what it is that the student's dealing with. Another category of exceptional children that often get overlooked is the gifted category, which is interesting because when we think of IEPs, we often think of students who have learning disabilities, but technically students who are incredibly gifted are also supposed to be receiving IEPs and special services. So this quote over here is direct word for word quoted from the National Association for Gifted Children. Citing my source here. So it says students with gifts and talents perform or have the capability to perform at higher levels compared to others of the same age, experience, and environment in one or more domains. They require modifications to their educational experiences to learn and realize their potential. So the idea is that if you have a child who is gifted beyond the years that they're supposed to be at, they should be getting individualized services as well to make their curriculum more challenging. And of course, the NAGC recognizes that gifted students come from all racial, ethnic, and cultural populations, as well as all economic strata. And what that means is gifted people are not limited to a particular race or a particular wealth level. They require sufficient access to appropriate learning opportunities. They can have learning and processing disorders on top of being gifted. So you can be autistic and still be gifted, right? You can be blind and still be gifted. And they often need support and guidance to develop socially and emotionally, as well as developing in whatever area that they have of talent. Do I have this one in your discussion notebook? I can't remember if I do or not. Oh, nope. Yep, I do. So if you go to your discussion notebook, one of the things you'll discuss for this time is, do you think schools do enough to support gifted students? Why or why not? What examples have you seen or not seen in your own educational experiences? And I anticipate that your answers will be all over the board depending on what school you went to. Some schools do really good with gifted programs. Other schools don't do anything with them. So I'm looking forward to seeing your varied experiences there. Alrighty. Oh, sorry, that was the literal question that I had on this slide. This is just something we would have discussed here. Sorry. But I'm not going to go into detail on that because I don't want it to influence how you answer your questions on this next one. There are two quick articles I'd like you to skim over on basically what gifted education is. I've got them loaded in our Moodle shell, so you can pull them up from there. The article's super short. This one over here is just a quick handout, so it's not a ton of reading. All right. At this point, you were clear to do everything on Anchor Project number 1. It will not be due until the end of next week. Next week, there will not be a video lesson for you. Other than that, there'll be a video that reviews the Anchor Project for you on there, but there's not new content to learn, if you will. You'll have all of week 3 to do this. The only other assignment in week 3 is just a quick discussion board, and it's nothing too complicated. So you do kind of have an easier load next week so that you can focus on getting your project done. As always, look at that, citing my sources. Not in APA format because trying to type APA on a cute slide is a pain in the neck, but I promise if it was an essay, I would put it in APA format. As you head into your Anchor projects next week, if you are having trouble on them, reach out to me. I want to help you. I want to hear from you. The worst part about an asynchronous class is that I don't get to physically be there with you and actually explain things to you and look at your projects as you work. So feel free to reach out to me at any point during the process. I am happy to help you. I want to hear from you. If as always, like I said, if you have any questions, reach out to me. And other than that, I'll look forward to reading your discussion board posts, grading your stuff, and seeing your Anchor projects next week. See you soon.